Welcome and thank you for joining us for the next presentation in our Animal Law CLE series. My name is Pamela Hart and I am the Assistant Dean and Executive Director of the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School. Joining us today is Clinical Professor Kathy Hessler, Director of our Animal Law Clinic and the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative. We are also delighted to have Dr. Lori Marino of the Whale Sanctuary Project and the Kimmela Center for Animal Advocacy as our guest. Together, Professor Hessler and Dr. Marino will share their expertise in this presentation on using the law and science to help animals.
Welcome to Using Law and Science to Help Animals, a CLE put on by the Center for Animal Law Studies. We're going to introduce ourselves briefly, and I'll do a quick overview of what we're doing today. We're going to do some presentations and then have some questions between us. So it's a little different style. Dr. Marino will be focusing on the scientific foundations, and I'll be focusing on the legal foundations. And then we'll have some conversation to try to highlight some of the conversation and the issues that arise in this context. So first, who we are. I'll let Dr. Marino introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Professor Hessler. I am thrilled to be here and to be presenting on the scientific foundations of animal law, something I'm very interested in. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a neuroscientist. I've studied the brains of dolphins and whales and other animals for 30 years. I used to be at Emory University, and now I am the president of the Whale Sanctuary Project and executive director of the Kimmela Center for Animal Advocacy. So it's really a thrill to be here. And I'll just say one other thing that since 2010, now it's 11 years, I've been involved in all kinds of legal cases of different types here and in Canada. And that's what led me to be really interested in the intersection between science and law. So thank you.
Well, and it's our honor and pleasure to have you here. And so my name is Kathy Hessler. I teach at the Lewis and Clark Law School. I direct the Animal Law Clinic there and the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative, which is a part of the Center for Animal Law Studies. I've been teaching and writing in the space of animal law for about 30 years. And so I'm delighted to be doing this CLE with Dr. Marino because it didn't take me very long in doing my work to realize how much I needed science and wanted to learn how to use it, how to understand it, and how to work with it in my work towards protecting animals. So our goal today together is to help legal professionals and help advocates understand the importance of science in their work, how to use it, when to use it, sort of where to start to protect animals. We want to let people know that this is an overview. We could talk for hours and hours about this. So it's going to be somewhat of a macro conversation and hopefully what we think the beginning of a conversation so that we're alerting people to the issues that they should be thinking about and sort of that gives them resources to begin to do their work. So before we begin, we like to do a land acknowledgement, letting folks know I'm speaking from Portland, Oregon, and here at Lewis and Clark, we honor the indigenous people on whose traditional land and ancestral homelands we stand. They include the Multnomah, Clackamas, Clackamas, Tumwater, Wallala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. In remembering these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. And we know that land acknowledgements can be challenging, but we feel they are important to do. And we think it's important to remember these folks and to think about the present day folks because we can learn so much from them about respectful relationships with animals and the planet from the historical and present day communities, including their conceptualizations of science, if you will. So really quickly, we want to have this CLE because we think that, or we know that animal law in all of its facets depends heavily on bringing scientific evidence and expertise to bear on the arguments that people make on behalf of other animals. And the task for arguing for other animals depends on our ability to utilize science effectively. And that's not something that law students typically learn how to do in law school. So people like me have to learn it on the fly, if you will, as I start doing my work. And so we want to help other people get a head start in getting some of that training, thinking about scientific methodology and how that's different and intersects with legal methodology. So how people can learn about that, the nuances of the sociology and the politics of science, just like people need to pay attention to those things in the legal area. So this session is designed to introduce people to those foundational scientific issues. And there's not enough time to discuss everything. So we really do want folks to understand it's an introduction. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Marino, who will begin to talk about some of these scientific foundations that are so important.
Thank you very much. When we first thought of doing this course, we felt that there were 4 major topics that would help us explore the role of science in animal law. One of them is interpreting and translating the scientific literature and subtopics that I'll go into momentarily. And another is critical analyses of hypotheses and just differentiating between what's good and bad science, what are strong and weak results. So I want to talk about these first 2 and then talk about the last 2. So in terms of interpreting and translating the scientific literature, if you're a scientist, you learn how to do that from the beginning. And it involves distilling a large body of literature into some very basic essential points. And if you're an attorney, you have to take all of that literature and distill it down to the essential components of your argument. You also have to take very complex findings and sometimes really jargony language and put it into non-scientific, digestible language. So here are some very high-level tips. And again, as Professor Hessler said, this is really just an introduction to some of the kinds of topics that can be gotten into in more depth and with more specificity. First thing is to always use the latest review or empirical article to get the current views of a topic. So if you're interested in a topic that might particularly be controversial in science, first, use a search engine like Google Search, check the citations, and always go to the most recent first, because that allows you then to backtrack into the history of that particular area, and you won't miss anything. And that's really, really important. One of the really important things that you should ask yourself when you're going through the literature is, are there inconsistencies in the scientific literature? We've all been taught that science is, very cut and dry, but it's anything but that. And when you go into a literature, like it could be on a certain capacity in a certain species, you're going to find a lot of stuff, and a lot of stuff that doesn't all say the same thing. So you first have to recognize that there may be inconsistencies in the literature and understand what they are and acknowledge them. And that's really important because and we could talk about this further, when you're in the courtroom, the last thing you want to be is caught blindsided. You want to know everything that's been written about the claim, the argument that you're making. And you may ask yourself other questions like, well, are there replications of this study, and why or why not? So really being critical about the literature, interrogating it yourself. In terms of translating the complex language, I think it's always best to use everyday language instead of scientific jargon. Scientific jargon is starting to sound kind of silly because of all the things we know. For instance, for a long time, I was told, don't use the word emotional, use the word affective. or don't use socializing, use affiliative behavior. And in fact, other animals don't eat. They actually only engage in ingestion behavior. um, those kinds of things can easily be confusing, and it's important to take all of that and put it into everyday language so everyone understands what you're talking about. Be precise, but don't use obscuring terms for what is clearly normal animal behavior. And don't use acronyms. Also, that's very important. Finally, on this point, I just want to mention that the word significant is something that you hear over and over in the scientific literature, and it actually has two meanings. And it's really important to wield that term properly. So it can mean important and substantive, right? I can say, this is a really significant event. But it can also mean statistically significant. And it's really important not to confuse them and to differentiate them, and to also catch it when, for instance, somebody who's arguing something different is using the word significant inappropriately. So that's a very important. Now I'd like to go on to critical analyses of hypotheses and identifying strong and weak results. And this is really fun. So it involves interpreting different types of data. What's the hierarchy of what's the gold standard of evidence, at least from the scientific point of view? How do you spot misleading statistical claims and graphics, hidden biases in terminology, and how to best represent statistical findings? Obviously, we can't go into this in a lot of depth. There's a few things I'd like to say. First is the hierarchy of scientific evidence. So in the world of science, the top tier is always experimental evidence. And the reason is because you have controlled conditions that allow you to make cause and effect statements. And that's really important. And experimental data can be quantitative, it can be inferential, there's hypothesis testing, but you can really only make causation arguments from data that is from controlled experiments. And there's a lot within that, but that's important to note. The next tier of would be observational data. And these are, where you saw something directly and you describe it, or somebody says they saw something directly and describe it. And that's sort of not as good as experimental data because you can't really tell cause and effect, but it can be pretty strong, and it can be both quantitative and qualitative. And finally, sort of the last tier is the testimonial and the anecdote. And these can range from the testimony of an expert to hearsay. And that can be quite a range. And it's all qualitative. And it really depends. And you're not going to be able to necessarily confirm any of it. So you have to use it with the knowledge that it's not the strongest line of evidence, but it can be used. So there's a hierarchy of evidence that's really important to be aware of. Getting to things like misleading scientific claims, one of the things that's really important to always check when you're reading a scientific paper is, what is the strength of the effect? A lot of people say, well, this is significant, statistically significant, but they have a sample size of a kabillion, right? Anything becomes statistically significant if you have a big enough sample size. And this is something that not a lot of people pay attention to, so you can be ahead of the game. If you can say to somebody, yeah, that's significant, but, you look at your sample size. I mean, of course, the strength of the effect is minuscule. And vice versa, you can say, well, sure, they didn't find this in the literature, but they didn't have enough statistical power. So that's something that really can get your opponent, because they're not going to be looking for that. Beware of scientism, meaning results that are dressed up like science but are not really science. And that's really, really important. And you see a lot of that in the gray literature and so forth. And check the axes on the graphs. In statistics, in psychology, there's a whole book called How to Lie with Statistics. And what it does is it informs you about how someone can create a graph and make an effect look bigger than it actually is. And those are important things, not only for spotting them in somebody who's opposing your arguments, but in terms of being fair and clear about how you provide information within your argument. And finally, hidden biases in thinking and in language, which is always a lot of fun to look at. We all know that we all come with cognitive biases, things like confirmation bias, hindsight bias. There's a whole slew of them, and really important as an attorney to understand the human psychology of biases, cognitive biases, because you'll be ahead of the game if you do. Beware of loaded terms. For instance, terms that are maybe promote a certain worldview, like terms like advanced versus primitive or high versus low animals. There's an inherent bias in those kinds of terms that you want to be aware of. And just generally watch for spin in abstracts and summaries. Next, the final two major topics are identifying the species-specific data most relevant to your arguments, especially if you're doing a welfare argument versus a rights argument. And then the most fun part, which it's fun, but it's also the most stressful part of being in science, is navigating the sociology and the politics of science, responding to opposing claims of the other party, how to tell when they're going beyond the data, how to choose a credible expert, and most of all, being proactive, anticipating and forestalling oppositional testimony and getting in the last word. In terms of identifying the species-specific data most relevant to your argument, know that within science, it is kosher, it is appropriate to argue by analogy across species, especially if you don't have specific data on the specific species that you're going into court for. Also, the level of evidence needed for each differs, and this is something I look forward to discussing later on. Rights-based arguments tend to be founded on capacities and on philosophical, legal, and logical arguments by analogy or comparison, whereas welfare arguments are based upon evidence of harm. And that's an oversimplified view from my point of view, so I look forward to talking about that further with Professor Hessler. Finally, in choosing an expert or an affiant, it's best to choose someone who has two characteristics. One is they've actually done the research themselves and not just renewed it. And they have good credentials. In other words, they've published in peer-reviewed journals. And they've had on-the-ground experience, because, if you pick somebody who's has 100 publications and they've never actually worked with the animal that you're talking about, someone's going to bring that up, and vice versa. So it's really important for your expert, your affiant, to have both the scientific credentials, the academic credentials, and the on-the-ground experience, if you can find someone like that. Also, in choosing an expert on the check on the person's reputation and whether they are embroiled in any active controversies, debates, or even scandals. And you don't want to find that out in the middle of the trial. And know about and be prepared to counter arguments based on studies that have not been replicated or are controversial. And finally, don't dismiss mixed findings out of hand, because they're there, they're out there. Someone will know about it and someone will bring it up to you. And it's better that you bring it up when it's appropriate, rather than being sort of caught off guard. There's, again, all kinds of intricacies to these topics, but I'll stop there and let Professor Hessler talk about the legal end of things.
Great, thank you. That's wonderful, and I think it raises so many interesting questions that we can talk about in a few minutes. So yeah. I will talk a little bit about the legal foundations and how law and science already intersect, should or shouldn't intersect. And so before I get into it, briefly, it's useful to think macro level again, how the law actually operates and how it sees animals. And so again, we're speaking in broad terms, some generalities of necessity just because of the time. But it's important to look at how the law views animals, right? Just generally, before we think about how we can use science to change that perception or change that view more broadly. And so thinking about the law, remember that the law is a system that tells us in society either what we must do or what we must not do, right? It's sort of the bounds of acceptable behavior, but it's not what we should do. And this is an interesting point that science can help us reflect on later. And so we can come back to that point. But thinking about animals within the legal system deems all animals as owned, right? So they're either owned by private individuals or corporations, or they're managed in the responsibility of government. And those would be wild animals, but all other animals are deemed owned. And that changes our relationship with animals. And it changes the lens through which we look at them, right? So we look at them typically through the owner's perspective or the manager's perspective. Also note that ownership does not necessarily come with what some of us might consider responsible care as a mandate. It allows owners to decide what happens to these animals, how they get used, how they're treated, and in some respects, right, how we might say how they're abused, right? So if they're being used for research purposes, or if they're being used in the food system, some of the behaviors I think many of us would agree are abusive. And even if we don't say abusive, because that's a legal conclusion, perhaps, we would say harmful, right? That we're harming these animals for another reason, for a benefit. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But it's permissible under the law for owners to inflict that harm on these animals. The other thing that the law doesn't view animals as is self-owning entities. And we'll come back to that when we talk a little bit more about how science focuses on especially rights versus welfare conversations. But they're not seen as self-owning, so they're not seen as being able to be self-determining in their actions and their activities. Animals are also seen as a plentiful resource, and in some respects, an unlimitedly plentiful resource, because we can keep breeding them for our uses. And some folks and some of the legal constructs see them as designed for use, right? That we want to use them for our purposes, and that they only have value in so much and insofar as they have benefit to human beings, right? A useful benefit or entertainment, whatever it might be. And so that's a legal approach, right? A really large structural sort of paradigmatic approach through which science and all of these other efforts to help animals have to come through. So it means that animals aren't seen as valuable in and of themselves as biological beings, right? Those are two really important things. So they're not seen as valuable by themselves, and they're not actually seen as biological beings. They're seen as products, right? As tools, as all kinds of things. And so the law doesn't really know how to value animal life. And that's both a scientific question and a political question and a sociological question and economic question that we won't get into all those details. And the law, it's useful to recognize, has challenges seeing and valuing human life, right? So what is a lost human life worth? That's a really challenging question for the law to address. And so the law sometimes already uses science to answer some of these very difficult questions. So it might use actuarial tables for how long a person might have been anticipated to live, for instance, or what to reduce to a cost, to a remedy, right? So a lost life or a lost limb. So the law tends to look at science to help answer some of those questions in part. And the law also doesn't tend to know how to value nature, if you will, like the natural world, the environment. And again, looks to science to help us understand ecosystems and the role of plants or animals or what have you within that system. But this is a challenge for the law, right? The law needs to rely on experts because lawyers don't have this expertise. So trying to marry that kind of external discipline expertise and put it into the process-based decision-making of the legal system is this sort of challenge that we have. So we have some precedent for how this is done elsewhere in the law, but it's useful to know how challenging it is for the law. So we just don't have metrics. And one of the problems when we put these two things together, that we don't have metrics for valuing and we don't actually see animals as biological beings, is that we therefore don't naturally ascribe value to these animals in and of themselves. And that means we don't sort of see them, we don't protect them, right? So we protect what we value, and the law can ascribe value. And so if the law is not doing that either accurately or fully or at all in some circumstances, then you see necessarily why the animals are not protected. So we can talk about that again a little bit more. So looking at how the law sort of interacts with science, again, sort of briefly, there are a lot of questions that we have. So which type of science to use, which domain, and from who and when and where? And so these are some things that Dr. Marino has already alluded to. What to do when the science is contested, what to do when the science is new. So when coming back to the contested point, sometimes science is contested, and when we say that, we mean within the scientific community, that a scientific consensus has not yet been achieved. So people are not comfortable asserting a certain point of view from a scientifically proven perspective. So in climate science, for instance, the scientists have a consensus, but the politicians do not. They don't accept it. So contested science, again, as Dr. Marino was suggesting, can mean two different things. It can mean within the scientific community or external to that community. It's useful to be paying attention to that when you're using the science and learning how to do that. So we have other questions about what to do when science doesn't, and here we're using law and science, right? These sort of macro images. So when the scientific community doesn't have an answer, when the community hasn't fully investigated an area, and when they haven't reached a consensus. So what do we do there? How do we treat sort of breakthrough studies, right, versus settled science, if you will, right? Those are two conceptions that we need to figure out how to incorporate. And I think, as Dr. Marino said, we need to know what we're using, explain why we're using it, and acknowledge, right, the sort of risks and challenges of using whichever one we're using, and know why we're doing that. One of the things that is challenging for the law is that it has a number of goals. And so one of its goals is to have a set of rules that people can use to make decisions about their behavior, with the idea that going forward, that the assumptions upon which they're making decisions are going to be still true, right? And so that means if the law says I can or can't do something, and I make a choice based on that, that's going to be true next year as well as it's true now. And so when I'm in trial, right, it will make sense. We have challenges, right, when we're using science, which evolves, information that evolves. So we want the certainty and the predictability to guide people's choices. And that's individuals, corporations, governments. But we also need to somehow incorporate the evolving science, right? So we have for too long been relying on outdated science in many respects with when we're talking about questions about animals. And we don't really know exactly how to use updated science, and we don't know, really importantly, how to mandate that the law consider new science. And so that's something, again, that we can come back to in a little bit. Some jurisdictions do, in other countries, mandate a review of a regular review every 5 years or every 10 years or what have you of their legal frameworks. And I think that's a good idea for laws. And I think it's a very good idea for laws in particular that are based on or touch on scientific information. So we have to balance this sort of ossification, if you will, of the law, right? We want to be set and settled and predictable, and we have to deal with the changes that are going on in the world around us. And so that's obviously a larger question than the one we present today, but it's part of what we're talking about. Another thing that we need to think about is so why and how the use of science in the law matters. And echoing again something that Dr. Marino said, context really matters. And so we know that in all of our work. We know that there are different conceptualizations of animals based on geography, on jurisdiction, on religion, on culture. And so that's really important to look at. One of the benefits of looking at science is sometimes it can take us out of that. And so the biology of a whale is the biology of a whale. Now, there may be environmental factors, right, that affect that biology or the capacities or capabilities of that particular animal that we can look at. But thinking about how we both are sensitive to the context in which we're using science and the benefits of using science so that we can have some more universalized conclusions about animals, and then we make the political decisions about what to do with that information. So because the law is not based on consistent and accurate understandings of animals, we have a lot of challenges. And so we'll come to some of the suggestions about how to deal with that in a minute. But thinking again about what kind of science we should be using, why and how, we need to think more broadly than we have been as a community of advocates, in that we're using a lot of the science to show how animals are harmed. And we need to expand that to what are the natural conditions for animals, what would their positive welfare be, not just avoiding a negative situation. And so, and including to not just physiological sentience kind of considerations, but also psychological, emotional capacities, right? So thinking about capacities and capabilities much, much more broadly. And in doing that, we begin to actually appreciate animals for themselves, right? We see that they're remarkable beings. All of them have some capacities that we don't have as humans. So what we have done as humans, and this makes total sense, but we have to change it, we have centered the human biome, if you will, the human biological framework as the default. And we're comparing animals, all other animals, to this default and seeing where they fall short. And if we can't prove that they are like us in any number of ways, then we say they are therefore less deserving, right? They're less valuable, they're not, all kinds of things. And so we need to decenter that human paradigm, that human sort of scientific, biological, psychological paradigm, and find other metrics to assess value, right? And so when we can step away from that, we can begin to say, oh my goodness, these animals bring so much to the world, and we need them. And so just thinking about that, we want to therefore recognize how they suffer. We don't want to get rid of that. That's a really important scientific question that we always need to answer. Then we need to recognize what they need to thrive and live natural lives. So that's a newer focus that we need to rely on science for. And we need to recognize our interdependence on one another. And that's something that crops up all the time, but we sort of forget. And so just a quick example would be, say, bees, right? So a lot of people don't like bees. They don't want to be stung by bees. They don't mind pesticides applied to bees. But when they realize we need bees for the food that we eat, right, with their pollinators, and they're used widely to help us create food, then all of a sudden we're like, oh, so I guess we need them. And not only do we need them, now we'll have legal statutes, right, to protect them and protect their habitats. Again, because we benefit from them and from their use. And so that's still problematic, but at least it's a recognition of our interdependence. And so those are the three elements that I would suggest that we need scientific data for in helping us answer questions, right? So how can animals suffer? How can they thrive? And how are we interdependent? And so I'm just gonna note a couple of these things below, the policy outcomes. So once we blend law and science, it has policy consequences, right? Good and bad. So the precautionary principle is just one example of that. It's taking a scientific principle that basically says, if we think we're going to cause harm and we're not sure of the outcome, then maybe we shouldn't do the thing, right? That's going to cause harm until we know, one, whether it's going to cause harm, and two, whether we can mitigate the harm that would be caused. And so we have to answer those questions before we move forward. That's moving forward in a cautious way, right? So that's a concept that's taken from a scientific approach that we can now bring into the legal realm, and then it would have policy implications. The 3 R's, many people are familiar with. This is a policy or a framework that was developed for animals in research laboratories. So reducing, refining, and replacing the use of animals in that setting. So again, that's a scientific framework that has different policy and sort of statutory, if you will, implications. So in some jurisdictions, this is more incorporated into the statutory framework. In the US, it's not very much done so. Same thing with the 5 freedoms. Concept of animals having the ability to sort of move and procreate and eat and engage in natural behaviors developed in the agricultural context from scientists. And if we apply that to the use of agricultural animals, then we have different policy outcomes. And again, we can talk about some of these things more later. So when we look at science, we do see that there are decisions that are made. Once a legislature realizes, okay, animals can feel pain, they can suffer, that usually leads to amendments of anti-cruelty statutes, strengthening of those statutes. It strengthens our endangered species analysis. And then we have very specific kinds of protections, entire statutory schemes like the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And that's predicated on some of our scientific understanding of who these animals are, what they need, and what we should be doing to protect them. Okay, so thinking about that, how does it get applied? And so one example here in Oregon is that the legislature found that animals were sentient. So they have legislative findings saying animals are sentient beings capable of experiencing pain, stress, and fear. As a consequence, they also found animals should be cared for in ways that minimize pain, stress, fear, and suffering. So this is a legislative finding. It's a framework for legislation going forward. And it was cited and used in judicial cases, including 3 at the Supreme Court level here in Oregon, which recognized some animals as victims. I won't go into detail right now. It may come up in our conversations later, but I just want to note that in addition to this particular case law, the Oregon situation is complicated, as it is in every state. So recognizing that animals are sentient and then having a statutory framework to restrict abuse and neglect of these animals does not come without its exceptions, right? And so there are always exceptions. And so in Oregon, even though animal is defined more broadly than in other states, which is good, so they can be seen as victims, they're defined as any non-human mammal, bird, reptile, amphibian, or fish. So that's a pretty wide and broad definition, which is really helpful. Insects are not included, but and so it's better than many jurisdictions, but then we have the exemptions. So treatment, good husbandry practices, so animals in rodeos, circuses, poultry, livestock, good veterinary practices, lawful fishing, hunting, trapping, and the exemptions go on, right? So what we've done here is say, yes, science has told us that animals are sentient, and therefore we should reduce their suffering, except when we don't want to, right? There's no biological reason that these animals in these contexts should be exempted. Because again, remember, we're talking about protecting animals from abuse, from neglect, right? From inhumane conditions. And we're saying that those things are bad, except, our goals in other contexts are so important that we're going to allow that to happen. So the actual statement of an exemption says an awful lot about where we are in the law. So we recognize the animals should be protected, except when we really don't want to protect them. Okay. Again, we can talk a little bit more about that. So I'll note really briefly that so statutes are a way to incorporate science in the judicial context, and as Dr. Marino mentioned, sort of a lot of focus on the litigation and how we would manage science in the litigation context. And certainly we should also be thinking about administrative agencies. That's another context in which science is used, and I should note, much more heavily than in the other two contexts. Agencies are much more used to getting information, spending time, having committees, hearing, having all kinds of ways to get data and to vet it and have other people look at it and have stakeholders from, all kinds of positions say what they think should happen and have people look at that information, so on and so on and so on, right? So we have a lot more experience using scientific and other kinds of data in the agency context. And so it's something just to be thoughtful about. So thinking about identifying animals as legal persons and as rights bearing, I want to sort of come back to those 3 points I made, right? Can they suffer? What do we know about what they need for living and thriving, and the interdependence and intersectionality, if you will, of our lives? And so, as Dr. Marino said, the proof of capacities ends up being pretty important, and we have to really broaden, right, that focus and talk about what kind of capacities and whether they're always measured as against human capacities, and if so, why? And this is not to say that maybe that shouldn't happen sometimes, but if it does, we need to have, again, a legal framework for saying why, and we need to have some decision-making about what that looks like and some intentionality rather than just defaulting to it and saying, well, of course, right? That's kind of how it is right now, and that's certainly insufficient. Okay, so one of the things I just want to, a couple of other challenges that we need to be attentive to when we're trying to integrate science is, as Dr. Marino said, so we're talking about human ideals and limitations and preconceived ideas. This is true in the legal setting and in the scientific setting. When you merge the two, you get sort of the double whammy, if you will, right? So we have to really be careful and very thoughtful about our decision-making, about our frameworks, about our evidence. Also, it's useful to point out that a lot of the scientific work, as Dr. Marino said, in the sort of controlled environment is where sort of the highest level of science come from. That means those animals are captive, right? They're in a different situation than their natural situation. And we know that captivity changes brain patterns, it changes brain function, it changes biology, it changes things. And so we're making some decisions about the benefit, right? The efficacy of the research protocols that come out of that, and trying to apply it maybe in a situation where it doesn't, it's apples and orange potentially, right? So that's something that we need to be thinking about. And we, as also referred to by Dr. Marino, scientists use what's called the phylogenetic scale, right? And this is this hierarchy of animals. And so human animals are seen as sort of the top of that hierarchy. And other animals, including like insects, right, are maybe at the bottom. And in part, it's because we don't know as much about their capacities and capabilities, but we have less protection and less valuing as we go further down the phylogenetic scale. And just one example is that when we're talking about alternatives to animals used in research, we're moving down from primates to other mammals. Then we're trying to move away from dogs. And so right now we're having an explosion of the use of zebrafish, right? And that's because they're actually seen as and actually technically correctly deemed alternatives. And this, is again bizarre. It's like if we want to say they're an alternative, they could be an alternative to mammalian research, but they're animals, so they shouldn't be deemed alternatives to animal research because they're animals. And that is right now technically what's happening. So we can, again, talk about that more later. So if we begin to change our framework, right, that animals aren't ours, they're not our property, they're not products, then it can change our vision, change some of the questions that we're asking. And we can talk a little bit later about some of the improvements based on this conversation that we think need to happen. Some of them are probably pretty clear from what we've already said. So we'll stop there. I'll actually stop sharing my screen because we're just going to move into a conversation now. So Thank you all for listening up to this point. And I know that Dr. Marino already has a number of questions ready. So do you want to start us, Dr. Marino?
Well, I'd love to, and thank you for that review. I learned a lot just in it, listening to it. One of the things that's really interesting to me is how human psychology interacts with how we put forth an argument, and as you mentioned, our feelings about other animals, either as property or objects or lower than us on a scala natura. And one of the things that I've been involved with is non-human rights cases with the Non-Human Rights Project. And thinking about when you are trying to argue for personhood for another animal, what does that trigger in the mind of a judge or just the public to say a chimpanzee is a person? And although we can say, well, it means, that they have certain capacities, doesn't mean they're human. Does the word personhood trigger things that are defensive in others? And what do we do about those kinds of things? Because that's so inherent in human psychology.
Yeah, it's a fabulous question, and one that many advocates have been grappling with for decades. And it implicates an additional thing, which is when we're trying to make work for law reform within the animal framework, we're doing a couple of things at the same time, and that's really challenging. And so one is to say we want to incorporate protections for animals, but we're also inherently, sometimes explicitly, critiquing the legal framework. And that's really hard to do at the same time. And this is what's exactly implicated in the conversation about rights and about personhood, right? Because if we could say, look, we think the personhood framework that we currently have is great, we just need to expand it, right, to include these other beings, it would be simpler, but we don't. Right? The personhood paradigm has been fraught from the beginning. Lots of other human animals haven't been included in that paradigm. And so it's been politicized, it's been misused and abused. And so we have problems with that framework. And so why is it that some human beings don't have full rights when corporations have rights, right? Or ships have rights. And so we have this convoluted conversation that we end up having to have. Mm-hmm. And so are we accepting the personhood paradigm, critiquing it, and then enlarging it? Or is there another way? And so the useful aspect to your question is that there are a number of ways that people are pushing forward to expand protections for animals. So personhood effort is one. And some people are saying it's super challenging for all of these reasons, because we do trigger immediately. We have to spend all this time deconstructing what the personhood paradigm is, where we agree with it, where we don't, what it means, and that it always means more than we interpret, right? Because that word person is so closely identified psychologically with us, to human beings. And people are like, wait a minute, right? I'm not the same as a dog. And how could you say such a thing? That's insulting. And it doesn't make any sense. And it's like, well, okay, but neither is a ship, right? So how does that work? So we spend time having to deconstruct that argument and kind of build it back up and say, this is actually what the personhood framework is. And it allows expansion beyond human beings. And therefore, here's our argument why it should include animals. So it's a lot of stages, right? But it is because there's this immediate psychological response to, wait a minute, you're equating animals with us. And we have been so trained to see them as separate and to see ourselves as so much more superior that it's not even a conversation that we should be having. So yeah, it's the right question to ask, because I think if we can think about those psychological triggers and we can think about things that open conversations and open doors for protecting animals. Like, well, we all agree that we shouldn't harm animals if we can avoid it, right? And if we can start there, you can build up. And no one knows what's going to work. And the nice thing about a large diversity of approaches is that some things that are happening over here will help the efforts that are happening over here. But I think that's the right question for us to be asking, right?
I'm sorry to interrupt. I mean, as you get at here, this is a question that's almost like an abstract, conceptual, philosophical question, because wouldn't it be great if we could push through personhood and change the paradigm in that way and get rid of those biases? And so you have the draw of that.
Yes, because many people are thinking that if we can get to the point where we can recognize other human beings through this process, almost by doing it for animals, right? So necessarily, if we recognize the need to protect other beings who aren't humans, that sort of is predicated on the idea that we've already established that all the humans get it. So it's another way of sort of thinking about that interdisciplinary work with other human concerns. And so I'm a person who thought that might be a good thing. I also recognize the naivete of that, right? That's just not how we don't work in a linear way. So we can say we love elephants and we're going to protect them, while we're still not sufficiently protecting children or poor people or immigrants. And so it isn't linear in that way. But if we can, it's a really significant task, right? To sort of reconceptualize and make personhood work. Right.
And even change the mindset about other animals, of course, other humans. That's a given that, they need to be recognized for their full personhood. When you think about if you can get somebody to say, yes, an elephant is a person under the law, or some aspect of the law, said common law, then you get a bonus with that, that you might not get if you get protections for the elephant, but don't push our human mindset of human exceptionalism into another space. So you, as a lawyer, I'm sure you're always grappling with the issue of how far do I push it into a qualitatively different realm, or how much how do I weigh the risks and benefits, essentially, of how I put forth a case or a piece of legislation.
Absolutely. And so thinking about so in choosing a strategy and thinking about, okay, what kind of scientific data can I rely on, and how much do I need to push the current paradigm within which I'm working, whatever that paradigm is.
Yeah.
And how successful am I going to be? And every advocate makes sort of different strategic choices about how much of that struggle to take on when you're trying to talk about real paradigm change. And all of it helps, again, right? So the people who just start small and say, look, I'm not going to convince this judge in this town or this legislator in this state to do what I want, if I'm asking for the whole thing, or if I'm even working towards that. So I'm just going to ask for a smaller thing.
Right.
And part of that comes with necessarily a different vision of animals, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's changing whatever the current status quo is that we feel like needs to be changed. And we wouldn't do that if there wasn't some harm we're trying to avoid. So it necessarily accepts a slightly different viewpoint, right? Mm-hmm. Of those animals, that they can suffer and that they do deserve protection. And so sometimes without even saying it, right, you can move that step forward, because it is understood sort of implicitly. And sometimes you need all of this information to say, okay, this is why we need to start paying attention to cephalopods, right? They're amazing and you're decimating them. And so pay attention. Yeah. And so I think depending on what arena people are working in, they need to be making these strategic decisions. And this is why your work is so helpful, because it provides a lens into data that people can use and hopefully have that inform their strategic decisions when they're at the outset.
Something you said previously made me think about the data, right? Which is not this monolithic thing. It is, it's data. It has different forms, and evidence has different forms. And one of the things you said was about experimentation, right? And so from the point of view of a scientist, if you have an experimental paradigm, you've got gold, right? Because I can say this causes this because I controlled this, and this, and it led to that. However, and here's something that's really important, makes you think about. You also brought up the important point that animals in tanks, animals in cages, animals who are manipulated in an experimental paradigm may not be representative of their wild counterparts. And you have an issue of external validity, right? You've got tons of internal validity, but you got uncertain external validity. And so it's always important to remember to see if you can look for how that capacity is used in a natural environment. I always say, when we looked at mirror self-recognition in dolphins, it's not like dolphins all around the world are using mirrors to check themselves out. There's, it has to be related to something they actually do in their real, ordinary, free-ranging lives. So experiments tell you what an animal can do under certain conditions, with all the caveats, and then observational field work tells you what they actually do. And both are important, and they both bring something different to the table.
Yeah, it's such an important point. And I think it's a good illustration of the human-centric starting point, right? So again, it's like, well, I know I'm me because when I see myself in the mirror, I know it's me and I know it's not another person. So that's a measure of cognitive capacity that humans achieve at, 2 or 3 years old. And so we'll see if the animals can do that too. It's like, well, in a way, that's the stupidest thing, because of course they can distinguish themselves from others, because how else would they interact? How else would they mate? How would they find food? How would they not bump into each other? I mean, it's such a bizarre starting point, but it makes total sense because we need, again, a metric, right? We need a way to measure. And the only way that we can think to do it is the way we think to do it, right? Because it's the way we think. And so trying to get out of that modality in a really large way is one of the big projects I think we have. And I think the movement towards alternatives to animals being used in testing is helpful because it helps us explore that in a number of ways and for a number of reasons. So one, animal testing is not really effective, right? So we have this fundamental problem that, some 90 to 95%, right, of the protocols that finally reach human clinical trials fail, which means animal models aren't great models, right? And it's like, we know that you can test on males and females for a pharmaceutical component and get a different outcome, right? So how on earth do we think it makes sense that we can be testing on different species and get useful data? Now we have gotten useful data, and that's why we think that, but it just, we need to go beyond that. And the other thing that we do, which is this ridiculous irony, is to say these animals are enough like us that we're going to get useful data to put into the human context, but not enough like us to protect them the way we would protect human models, clinical models. And so that's this fundamental philosophical, ethical dilemma that we really have to face. And so one of the challenges, again, is just staying within our human-centric platform, because when we go beyond that, we can say, well, why don't we, we're moving towards computational biology and, organs on a chip and tissues on a chip, so that we can, and not even that, but personal, like medicine, right? So that someone would say, it's not just women, right? It's not just it's me, right. It's specifically me.
Your genome, yeah.
Exactly. So if I give you this medicine, how is it going to react with you? And that takes into account all your biological and environmental factors. Right. That's what we should be doing, right?
Exactly. And I think, that calls to mind the fact that this is a very complex issue because, if somebody says to you, are elephants like humans? I'm going to say yes and no at the same time. And I think what that says is that yes, they're just like us in many ways because we have the same kinds of brains and the same kinds of mechanisms and processes in our bodies. And if I suffer because I'm all alone in a room, an elephant is going to suffer for those same reasons and have a similar experience. At the same time, you acknowledge the fact that an elephant and a human are different versions of a mammal. And so this is not black and white. This is about acknowledging cross-species comparisons, evolutionary conservation of capacities and the brain, and also acknowledging at the same time the way it's expressed in different species. And that's not as easy as just, yes, an elephant's the same or no, an elephant's not the same. But that's where we are with the data and the science.
That's right. And so
Yeah.
advocates have a challenge there too. So just as I point out the irony in the research labs, we have in the animal protection community the same kind of irony, which is I want people to care about elephants. And so if I can convince them or help them understand that they suffer like us, if they are like us, then people have more empathy for them and they see them as connected, right? As part of the world community. And so we are at the same time trying to say they're enough like us to care about and to protect. And we need to assume that they have, some intelligence and some sentience and just like other mammals and, just like we do. And it would be a much better starting place if we could start there. And at the same time, that reifies the human model, right, as the metric by which we're valuing things, that we only value them because they're like us. And when we start to talk about, bees or insects or other animals that seem more different, more foreign, if you will, right,
Yeah.
from the human context, it's hard to develop that empathy. And it's sometimes I think almost more useful because we can say, but look at how wonderful they are. Look at what they can do. So if researchers didn't think fish had sentience because they didn't have brain stems and they thought that's how the nerves traveled, right? And the messages were sent to the brain. It's like, they can still feel pain. We know they can feel pain. And they just have this really interesting, different physiology for experiencing it. And that's so cool, right?
Yeah.
And so if we get beyond thinking that there are only certain ways to experience the world.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so hopefully, but it's a big project, right? It's both in science and in law, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. And I'm recognizing that we may be sort of at the end of our time. I know that you and I could continue to talk for a very long time.
All day and into the next day.
Yes. But in the interest of time, I think we'll call it for the day. And I want to thank you for joining me in this wonderful conversation. And I've learned a lot, and I know that others will have as well.
Me too. Thank you. Thank you very, very much for the opportunity, and be well, everyone.
Agreed. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Professor Hessler and Dr. Marino, for tying together the intersection of science and the law and highlighting why it's so important to helping animals. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Stay tuned for more on-demand animal law CLE webinars from the Center for Animal Law Studies. Thank you.